I would say firstly, be very sure what it is, what the problems are that you're trying to solve. Because in many instances, in many countries, qualifications frameworks have been introduced in the hope of solving a whole range of different problems, whereas they're not necessarily the appropriate policy mechanism for those specific problems. It's really important to understand the underlying factors and address the root causes, which qualifications frameworks in many instances don't do. Secondly, I think it's important to mention that qualifications frameworks originated in English-speaking countries, where relationships between education and labour markets and also between education and work have in many instances been weak. And although qualifications frameworks were posed as a solution to this problem and to these weaknesses, a lot of research indicates that they might be better understood as a symptom of the problem than a solution to it. And there's actually very, very little evidence that they have actually solved those problems. And finally, I'd say that there are very many different ways of doing a qualifications framework. There is the English model, which has been the dominant model in many countries in the world, but it's not the only way. There are different systems that are being adopted in different European countries, and I would say what's really important is to build on what's already there, not to try and change things dramatically. Don't change qualifications, don't change institutions dramatically, but to try and build on what's already there. And I think perhaps one of the main things that qualification frameworks can do is get different role players, different stakeholders together in the same room, talking about issues, surfacing issues that are of concern and that perhaps aren't being addressed in any given country. And then in that sense, I think it's best to see qualifications frameworks as a process, as a way of getting people together, and rather than a kind of fixed policy that is going to solve all of your problems. I think that it would not be the top of my list of priorities for development organizations to be supporting, because I think it's more important to support education institutions in developing countries, and I think it's more important to support economic reforms that can actually lead to the demand for more educated people, more people trained in occupational and vocational areas, which there often isn't in developing countries, which are dominated by informal labour markets, and which have very weak education and training systems in the main, obviously with pockets of exceptions. The problem with starting with a qualifications framework is that firstly it sometimes leaves the impression that you've done whatever it is that you need to do, and secondly it often tends to be the kind of development support which is focused on hiring consultants, either from the developed countries that are giving the support, or even wealthy consultants in developing countries. And so it tends to channel a lot of money not into meeting the needs of really poor people. And then the country is left with a framework, but not much else. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing or that it should be opposed, but it wouldn't be number one on my list of things for donors to support in developing countries.